All Lillian Moore wanted was to do the right thing, return a wallet she'd found on the street. Instead, two police officers laughed at her, tossed insults about her race and age, and treated her like she didn't belong. But these tough cops had no idea the woman they were humiliating was the FBI director's mother. What happens when power meets justice in the most unexpected way? Share your thoughts below and let's get into it. I can still picture that morning in Cedar Hollow like it was yesterday. The air had that crisp early fall bite, but the sunlight was warm enough to soften it. Gold spilled over the rooftops, and the faint smell of wood smoke drifted from someone's chimney. Leaves scratched along the pavement as the breeze carried them in lazy circles. It was the kind of morning that makes you slow down without realizing it. And that's exactly how Mrs. Lillian Moore moved steady, unhurried. She was 72, but you wouldn't guess it from her posture. Her back was straight, her steps deliberate, and there was a quiet dignity in the way she carried herself. A beige knit coat hugged her shoulders, a light scarf was tucked neatly at her neck, and in one hand she held a worn cloth tote that looked like it had been with her for decades. Inside that tote was a brown leather wallet she'd found just outside the town hall. The cash was still inside the ID cards, stacked exactly as they had been. Most people might have pocketed it without thinking twice. But Lillian wasn't most people. She was headed to the police station to hand it over. No fuss, no expectation of thanks. That was just who she was. She passed storefronts with windows lined in pumpkins and faded harvest wreaths. A few shopkeepers waved from their doorways. She waved back, her face calm, almost unreadable except for the faintest spark in her eyes. Halfway down Main Street, she caught sight of Harold Jenkins while sitting on the bench outside the cafe. Harold, a white man in his mid-60s, had hands like shovels from a lifetime of farm work and a voice you could hear clear across a field. "Morning, Lillian," he called, smiling wide. "Morning, Harold," she replied, stopping for a moment. He leaned forward on his cane. "You headed into the station?" "That's right. Found a wallet this morning," she said, tapping her tote. Harold shook his head with a small laugh. "Of course you did. And of course you're the one bringing it back. You know, I still tell people about the time you saved my land from those developers. If you hadn't spoken up for me at that hearing," Lillian waved a hand gently. "That was a long time ago." "Still," he said, his voice softening, "people don't forget things like that." She smiled faintly, then excused herself. "Better get this done before the owner comes looking." As she crossed the street toward the brick front police station, the mood shifted. Three young officers leaned against the wall, outside, coffee cups in hand. The moment their eyes landed on her, the smirks appeared. One nudged the other, muttering something I couldn't hear, and both chuckled. They didn't bother saying hello. Lillian reached the bottom of the station steps and paused. For just a breath, she stood still, one hand adjusting the scarf at her neck. Then she drew in a slow, measured breath, the kind you take when you've already made peace with whatever you might face inside. Her eyes held steady, but there was a flicker, a knowing look like she'd been here before in one way or another. Without a word, she straightened her shoulders, climbed the steps, and pushed the heavy glass door open. The glass door swung shut behind me with a soft thud, sealing out the street noise and letting the air of the station settle around me. I could feel the room before I really saw it, phones ringing somewhere in the back, a printer rattling, a chair scraping against tile. The place had that lived-in smell of overbrewed coffee and old paper. A bulletin board near the door held flyers in a rainbow of faded and fresh one-half-torn notice, curling at the edge. I stepped aside, letting a young officer brush past, and let my eyes move toward the front desk, like I was watching a stage before the play began. Frank Doyle was holding court. Mid-40s, broad-shouldered, the kind of man whose laugh was more about showing teeth than sharing joy. He leaned on the counter, spinning out a story that had his audience smirking. It was one of those jokes you recognize before the punchline race thinly veiled as humor. He pitched his voice up and down, tossed in a hand gesture for effect, and waited for the room to answer him with a chuckle or a nod. He was testing the air, and everyone knew it. Amy Collins, all 28 years of her, stood a few steps away, shoulder propped against the counter, sipping from a paper coffee cup. Her hair was pulled into a tight ponytail that didn't soften the sharpness in her eyes. She laughed along short, sharp bursts, her gaze flicking over to measure Lillian from head to toe, like she was assessing whether the woman in front of her belonged here at all. I watched Lillian step forward, calm, steady. She didn't seem in a rush to interrupt, but she wasn't here to linger either. "I'd like to turn in a wallet I found," she said, her voice level. Amy's nails tapped the side of her cup, slow and deliberate. Lost and found's over there if you can manage the walk, she said lightly, chin tilting toward a far corner without actually pointing. The smile on her face never reached her eyes. Frank turned toward Lillian, smirk settling into place. Looking for a reward or a medal. Neither, Lillian said. Just the right desk. She placed the wallet on the counter, aligning it carefully with the edge. Found it outside Town Hall about 8:10 this morning. Cash is still inside. ID too. Her hands didn't tremble. Her posture was still and sure. Frank's grin deepened, the kind that meant trouble. Well, you found a desk. Whether it's the right one that's above your pay grade. A small snicker came from one of the younger officers standing nearby. The sound was soft, but it traveled rippling through the room like a pebble dropped into still water. Amy leaned in, lips curling. Or maybe she just needs some company at her age. The laughter that followed was sharp, cutting the space between them like glass. It wasn't loud, but it didn't have to be. At a bench near the wall, Harold shifted in his seat. His brow creased, and he half rose before a bad knee reminded him why he shouldn't. That's uncalled for, he muttered to the man beside him, not quite under his breath. The man only glanced at the sign that read, "Keep voices low," and gave Lillian an apologetic shrug. Lillian's eyes met Harold's for the briefest second, and she gave him the smallest nod. Then she looked back at Frank, her expression steady. Just doing what's right, she said, the words quiet but carrying. Frank chuckled low and dismissive, as if her answer didn't warrant more than that. But I saw Amy's gaze flicker just slightly to the clock on the wall and then toward the door. Like she just remembered that time has a way of bringing things you didn't plan for. Lillian didn't push back. She didn't need to. Sometimes silence is heavier than a raised voice. She squared the wallet again on the counter, then folded her hands loosely in front of her, waiting. She had the air of someone who had stood in rooms like this before, someone who understood that patience can be its own form of power. And in that moment I knew, though they didn't, that the first crack had just appeared in the room's easy confidence. The laughter hadn't faded all the way when Lillian's eyes began to move. Not hurried, not defensive, just a slow sweep of the room, as though she were cataloging it in her mind. Her gaze paused at the Officer of the Month plaque, Frank Doyle's grin frozen in polished wood and glass, and then slid to the framed department code of conduct mounted beside it. The words were neatly printed in bold type, but the dust gathering along the top edge told its own story. Ethan Ward was leaning against the side counter, a clipboard in hand, pretending to review a form. 25 still knew enough to keep his uniform crisp and his boots clean, but not new enough to miss what was happening. His eyes shifted between Frank, Amy, and Lillian. He didn't join in the laughter. If anything, he looked like someone trying to figure out how the room had landed in the wrong tone without anyone noticing. Lillian reached into her handbag, not fumbling, but with the calm of someone who's done this before. She laid the wallet on the counter first, then a small envelope of papers aligning each with the same care a detective might use when logging evidence. No wasted motion, no hesitation. Frank raised an eyebrow, leaning closer like he was peering into a curiosity shop. "What's next, Grandma gonna teach us law?" It was meant as a jab, but the words hung there for a second longer than he probably intended. Lillian didn't flinch. She simply met his gaze, the faintest smile resting at the corner of her mouth, not mocking, not amused, but something steadier, as though the question wasn't worth answering yet. From his place at the counter, Ethan's brow knit just slightly. It wasn't the remark that caught him. It was her, the way her hands moved, how she kept her posture open but never submissive. The way she seemed to weigh the room without giving anything away. She wasn't defensive. She wasn't intimidated. And she didn't look like someone who'd wandered in without knowing exactly where she was. Harold, still seated near the wall, leaned toward the man beside him. "They have no idea who they're talking to," he murmured, his voice low but certain. I caught the flicker of a smirk from Lillian at those words, though she never looked in Harold's direction. Her eyes were still on Frank, measuring him now, maybe the way a chess player studies an opponent who doesn't yet realize the game has begun. Amy sipped her coffee again, though the edge in her posture had shifted. The confidence from a few minutes ago was still there, but now it carried a faint undercurrent of unease. Her glance toward Ethan was quick, almost impatient, as if silently asking why he was still watching this woman, like she was more than just an errand walker with a found wallet. Lillian placed the envelope squarely on top of the wallet. "Everything's accounted for," she said simply. Name, address, driver's license, cash. It belongs to a Mr. Walter Green. I thought it best to bring it straight here. The words were polite, but there was an unmistakable weight to them, like she was reminding them gently what their actual job was. Frank gave a short laugh, though it sounded more like clearing his throat. Well, we appreciate the effort. Not everyone's got the time to be that thorough. That's true, Lillian replied, her tone unchanging. Not everyone does. Something about the way she said it made Frank's smirk falter for just a beat. Ethan noticed. So did Harold. And so did I. It wasn't that Lillian had raised her voice or made a scene. It was the opposite. Her restraint was deliberate. Every move, every word seemed chosen. And in a room where noise usually won silence like that carried twice the weight. Ethan set his clipboard down on the counter, his eyes flicking once more to the plaque on the wall, then back to her. I could see it on his face, the slow forming of a question he wasn't sure he should ask. Not yet. But Harold's quiet warning lingered in the air, and if Frank or Amy had caught it, they pretended not to. What they didn't realize, what I could see starting to form in Ethan's expression, was that the first crack in the station's easy dominance had just opened. And the longer Lillian stood there, the wider it was going to get. Frank didn't just flip through the wallet, he dissected it piece by piece like a predator savoring its kill. Every card, every scrap of paper was held a moment too long, his thumb dragging slowly across the edges as though he might uncover something incriminating just by touch. The room had gone quieter except for the faint shuffle of boots on the tile and the steady hum of the fluorescent lights. A few people in the waiting area leaned forward, sensing something ugly was brewing. Amy stepped away from the counter's edge, the click of her heels sharp against the floor. She came in close, too close, her voice dripping with mock concern. You sure this isn't yours? Her head tilted slightly, eyes narrowing in mock analysis. I've seen plenty of folks try this trick, hand something in, wait for the thank you, maybe a little cash, or just the glory of looking noble. Frank chuckled, not looking up. Looking noble's one thing, he said, pulling out a folded receipt and holding it up to the light but lying. That's a whole different game. He set the receipt down and with deliberate disrespect let the wallet fall onto the desk. It didn't just land, it slapped against the wood, the sound as sharp in the stillness. Lillian's gaze didn't flicker. Her mouth was a firm line, eyes steady on Frank, like she'd already weighed him and found him wanting. Still, she said nothing. That silence seemed to irritate him more than any protest would have. He leaned forward, bracing one hand on the counter. Some people just look guilty, he said, his grin widening, and you, ma'am, you fit the picture. From the far end, Ethan straightened. Frank, enough! Rookie Frank snapped, his voice cracking like a whip. Stay out of this before you drown in waters you don't understand. Amy smirked at that, then turned her attention back to Lillian. Funny thing is, she said, lowering her voice to a near whisper, people with clean hands don't mind being asked questions. You seem awfully quiet. Behind them, Harold's cane tapped once against the floor. Sharp, deliberate. He stepped forward, his voice carrying across the room. She's doing the right thing. Maybe show some respect instead of playing sheriff in your own little fiefdom. Amy's head swiveled toward him and, sir, unless you're here to file a report, step away from the desk. Her words were flat, but her eyes were icy, as if she enjoyed the sting they carried. Harold's nostrils flared. He didn't move at first, not until he caught Lillian's gaze. There was no fear there, only a calm, unspoken command. Not now. Reluctantly, he stepped back, but his eyes stayed locked on Frank like a warning shot left unfired. Frank picked up the envelope of papers, turning it between his fingers before letting it drop on the wallet with a dull thud. You know, he said, voice low and mocking, people think they can stroll in here, play the part of a good Samaritan. But I've been at this a long time. I can smell when something's off. Lillian's hand moved slowly, reclaiming the wallet and envelope. She aligned them neatly, her movements precise, like someone filing away evidence, not defending herself. She didn't look at him once. That somehow was the loudest response of all. The air in the room shifted heavier, charged. Ethan's jaw tightened. Harold's grip on his cane whitened. Even Amy hesitated, her smirk faltering for just a second. And I swear in that moment everyone realized the same thing, whatever they thought they were dealing with. They were wrong. Frank had been riding the wave of his own arrogance so long you could tell he didn't expect any pushback. That's why her voice cut sharper than anything else that day. Funny thing about guilt. Lillian said, her tone calm but carrying across the room. Sometimes it's on the other side of the desk. The words landed like a stone dropped in still water, small at first, but the ripples reached everyone. Frank froze mid-motion, one hand still resting on the counter. What's that supposed to mean? His voice was low, but the edge in it made the hair on my arms stand up. She didn't answer him directly. Instead, she offered the faintest smile, just enough to say she wasn't rattled, and eased herself into one of the waiting area chairs. Every move was deliberate, like she had all the time in the world. From where I stood, I could see her eyes scan the room, not hurried, not nervous, but assessing. They paused on each face for a fraction of a second, as if she was reading the fine print on every soul in the place. Ethan shifted on his feet. He'd been quiet up to now, but I caught the way his brows pulled together. He was starting to see it too. This wasn't just some elderly woman caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. There was training behind those eyes. Experience. Amy leaned toward Frank, her voice dropping low enough that only a few of us could hear. She thinks she's clever, she muttered, but she's still just a nobody. The corner of Harold's mouth twitched upward. He'd been watching all along, arms folded over his chest, Kane leaning against his leg. Just watch, he said, almost to himself. Frank straightened, trying to reclaim the room. He gave a quick glance at Ethan, like daring him to speak, then turned his gaze back to Lillian. You've got something you want to say, ma'am. Now's the time. Otherwise, she cut him off, not with words, but with a single raised brow and that same faint smile. No rush, no panic, just the kind of composure that makes you wonder if you're the one being tested. The silence stretched, and in that stillness, I could feel the shift. The power in the room wasn't sitting behind the desk anymore. It was in the quiet corner chair, legs crossed, hands folded neatly in her lap. Frank's jaw tightened. Amy tapped her pen against the counter, her smirk starting to look more like a defense mechanism. And Ethan kept watching her like a puzzle he was one piece away from solving. Harold, he just kept smiling like he already knew exactly how this was going to end. The shift in the room. I swear you could feel the air in that station change before anyone even realized why. Lillian sat in that hard plastic chair, her handbag resting on her lap like it was nothing special. She didn't fidget, didn't glance nervously around. Instead, she reached in, pulled out her phone, and tapped the screen twice. Her thumb paused for just a second before she typed 3 short words, "at the station." Then she sent it to Marcus. No one knew who Marcus was. Most thought it might be a friend, maybe a lawyer. But I noticed the way her hand lingered on the phone, almost like she knew exactly what would happen next. A minute later, the door at the far end of the room swung open. Not with a bang, not with a show of force, just a clean, confident push. A man in a tailored charcoal suit stepped inside his tie, perfectly knotted, his shoes still shining from the rain outside. He wasn't here to make small talk. In his hand, a thick manila envelope. He crossed the room with the kind of stride that told you he'd walked into plenty of tense rooms before. He stopped at the front desk, leaned in just slightly, and said in a low, even tone that somehow carried to the far wall, "Director's family." That was it. 2 words that seemed to pull the plug on every casual noise in the place. I caught Ethan's face first. He'd been leaning back in his chair, arms crossed, wearing that bored, almost smug look you see on guys who think they've already figured everyone out. But when those words hit his ears, something shifted. His eyes flicked toward Lillian, just a quick glance, but the kind you can't take back. It was like he was seeing her for the first time and realizing he'd been underestimating her by a mile. Amy was standing by the coffee pot, pretending to stir sugar into a cup she hadn't even poured. Her lips pressed together tight, and she kept her eyes down, but her shoulders had that subtle stiffness that comes from hearing something you really didn't want to hear. Frank, though, he was still running his mouth to another officer, telling some story that had him grinning like a guy in a bar. He hadn't caught on yet. If anything, he seemed louder in the sudden hush, his voice grating against the new current in the room. Lillian didn't rise, didn't even turn her head. She just glanced at her watch, a small silver thing with a worn leather band, and gave the faintest nod. Her eyes stayed steady, calm, but not empty. There was something deeper there, a quiet certainty that didn't need to prove itself to anyone. Harold, sitting a few seats away, straightened his back. He wasn't grinning. Harold never really grinned, but there was a spark in his eyes now, the kind you see when a man knows a hand is about to be played, and it's not the one everyone else is betting on. Ethan shifted in his chair, leaning forward just enough to catch Harold's eye. "What's going on?" he muttered. Harold's reply was almost a whisper. "Watch." The man in the suit handed the envelope to the duty sergeant, who flipped it open just enough to scan the top page. I couldn't see what it said, but I saw the color drain from the sergeant's face. His mouth opened, then closed again, like he was weighing every possible response and finding none of them safe. Across the room, Amy's phone buzzed in her hand. She glanced at the screen and tucked it away without answering. Her jaw tightened, and for a moment she looked like she wanted to be anywhere but here. Frank finally noticed the shift. He trailed off mid-sentence, his laugh dying in his throat. His eyes moved between the suited man, the sergeant, and Lillian, trying to piece together a puzzle that was already leaving him behind. Lillian crossed one leg over the other, her movements slow and unhurried. Her gaze swept the room, not challenging, not timid, just knowing. She met Ethan's eyes for a brief moment, and he looked away first. The suited man leaned down again to the sergeant. This time his voice was too low for me to hear, but whatever he said had the sergeant nodding immediately, his pen moving fast across a logbook. A long, heavy silence followed. Not the comfortable kind. This was the kind that wraps around you, pressing in, making you hyper-aware of every breath. You could hear the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead, the ticking of the wall clock, the distant sound of a printer spitting out paper somewhere down the hall. I watched Lillian in that moment. She wasn't smiling, but there was a trace of satisfaction in her eyes, like someone who'd seen this exact scenario unfold a dozen times in her mind. She didn't gloat. She didn't lean into the drama. She just waited. Ethan cleared his throat, his earlier arrogance replaced with something closer to caution. Amy shifted her weight from one foot to the other, her coffee still untouched. And Frank kept looking at Lillian like maybe he'd missed something huge, something that might just come back to bite him. The man in the suit stepped away from the desk and gave Lillian a small nod, barely more than a dip of his chin, but it carried weight. She returned it with the same understated acknowledgement. Nobody said it out loud, but everyone in that room was thinking the same thing. Something had just changed, and whatever it was, it had nothing to do with luck. Lillian glanced once more at her watch, then folded her hands in her lap. Her breathing was steady, her posture unshaken. If you didn't know better, you'd think she was simply waiting for her name to be called. But Harold knew better, I knew better, and judging by the way Ethan was now studying her, so did he. Something or someone was coming. And when they did, this whole place was going to feel it. The arrival. The sound came first, a sharp, deliberate click of the latch before the door swung open. Not just opened, it commanded the space. Marcus Moore stepped through, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a perfectly cut dark suit that somehow carried more authority than any badge could. His skin was deep and rich. His hair cropped close, streaked just enough with gray to suggest both wisdom and years in the fight. There was no hesitation in his stride, no searching the room to get his bearings. Marcus already knew exactly where everyone was. Behind him, two agents in matching suits moved like shadows, alert scanning, but never distracting from the man they followed. The room's energy collapsed inward. Ethan, who had been leaning back just minutes ago, snapped to attention so fast you could hear the chair legs scrape against the tile. Amy took 2 small steps back, her shoulder brushing the wall. And Frank just blinked. Once. Twice. Like maybe his mind needed a moment to download the reality standing in front of him. Marcus's eyes went straight to Lillian. Everything in his presence shifted, not softer exactly, but warmer. He crossed the room in slow, controlled steps until he was standing right in front of her own. "Mom," he said, his voice a low rumble that carried across the room without effort. "Are you all right?" It was the kind of question that was less about getting an answer and more about letting everyone within earshot know exactly who she was to him. The silence that followed was different, heavy, personal. A chair creaked somewhere in the corner as someone shifted their weight. You could hear the faint hum of the vending machine in the hall. Nobody dared cough. Frank was the first to break it, not because he wanted to, but because his mouth seemed to be working faster than his brain. "She's your mother?" he asked, his voice higher than usual, like the words had to fight their way out. Marcus turned his head just enough to look at him. "Yes," he said, letting the words sit for a beat. Then in a tone that was calm, but carried the force of a verdict, "You mocked the woman who raised the director of the FBI. The words hit like a hammer wrapped in velvet quiet, but you felt the weight all the same. The kind of line that would replay in your head hours later, long after the sting set in. Across the room, Ethan's jaw tightened. Amy lowered her eyes. Frank's face lost what little color it had left. Harold leaned back in his chair, a slow smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Now they know, he murmured, just loud enough for those closest to hear. Marcus didn't linger on the humiliation in the room. He turned back to his mother, lowering his voice so only she could hear. Whatever he said next, she answered with a simple nod, steady, calm, exactly as she'd been from the start. And for the first time since I'd walked into that station, the balance of power wasn't just shifting, it had flipped entirely. The consequences. Marcus didn't shout. He didn't have to. His voice cut through the air like a clean blade. Separate them, he ordered, eyes locked on Frank and Amy. Statements. Now. The two agents moved instantly, boots firm against the floor. Movements sharp, precise. The casual chatter from earlier evaporated. You could feel the shift, like the temperature in the room had dropped 10 degrees. Lillian stayed seated, her posture regal, her hands resting gently in her lap. No smirk, no triumphant spark, just that calm, unreadable composure. It was the kind of stillness that demanded more respect than any outburst could. Marcus stepped forward, his shadow cutting across Frank. When you humiliate her, he said each word, slow, deliberate, you humiliate the Bureau and the law itself. Frank's jaw twitched. I didn't, you did, Marcus cut in his tone like the slam of a gavel. And you did it in front of witnesses. That makes it worse. The first agent grabbed Frank's wrist, the steel cuffs snapping shut with a crisp, final click. Frank flinched, not from pain, but from the realization that the moment he thought he controlled had slipped completely out of his hands. Amy had taken a small step back, but the second agent was already beside her. Ma'am, you'll come with me, he said firmly. Her voice wavered. It was just a joke. Marcus's head turned sharply toward her. You think belittling a woman like her is a joke? You think undermining the dignity of someone you barely know is harmless? His voice didn't rise, but the weight in it made her shoulders sink. Amy's eyes fell to the floor. Her fingers trembled as she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. She didn't say another word. Ethan, still frozen in place, watched it all with a strange mix of shame and awe. His training had never prepared him for this, not the authority, not the exposure, and definitely not the quiet power of the woman sitting there unshaken. She caught his gaze for just a heartbeat. No smile, no frown, just that steady, measured look. And in that silent exchange, he understood. This wasn't about status. It wasn't about titles. It was about principle and the fact that respect isn't optional. The agents escorted Frank and Amy toward the hallway. The sound of the cuffs, the shuffle of their shoes, the muffled creak of the door closing, it all seemed louder than it should have been. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was thick, heavy, filled with the unspoken truth that nothing in this room would go back to the way it was. Marcus finally turned to his mother, his voice soft enough for only her to hear. It's over, he said. And maybe it was, but as I watched, I couldn't shake the feeling that, for some of them, it was only just beginning. The room had gone still. The shuffle of agents escorting Frank and Amy out had faded down the hallway, leaving behind a silence so heavy it seemed to press on every shoulder in the courtroom. Sunlight slanted in through the high windows, catching dust motes that drifted in the air, as if the whole world had paused to witness what would come next. Marcus took a slow step closer to the defense table, his presence still commanding, even without a raised voice. He looked at his mother, steady, calm, yet unmistakably dignified. Mom, he said, the weight in his tone unmistakable. I'm sorry you had to go through this. Lillian's gaze didn't waver. There was no bitterness there, only a quiet resolve. She folded her hands neatly on the table before her, the kind of posture that told you she'd weathered storms before and would weather many more. I'm not, she replied, her voice low but steady, each word carrying the weight of years. Some lessons need to be taught the hard way. She turned then slowly to face Ethan. The young officer stood stiffly by the door, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes darting between her and the floor. Young man, she said, her tone soft but cutting straight through the air. Remember, respect costs nothing, but the lack of it, that will cost you more than you can imagine. Ethan swallowed hard, the words landing deeper than he expected. He'd faced armed suspects, tense standoffs, and long, grueling nights on the job, but he'd never felt this particular kind of weight, a truth that couldn't be dodged or ignored. "Yes, ma'am," he answered quietly, the words not just an acknowledgement, but a promise. Marcus watched the exchange in silence, his jaw set, but there was a glint in his eyes, a quiet pride, not just for the woman who had raised him, but for the moment itself, the reminder that authority and dignity weren't always about who carried the badge. From the bench, Harold had been watching closely. Now the older man leaned back slightly, a faint smile tugging at his lips. He nodded once toward Lillian, a silent gesture of absolute agreement. "You handled this with more grace than most could muster." Harold finally said, his tone warm but laced with respect. "And you've given them something they won't forget." Lillian didn't respond immediately. She simply inclined her head, acknowledging his words without needing to add to them. The room remained quiet, but it wasn't the brittle silence from before. This was different, heavier, but in a way that felt settled. It was the kind of quiet that comes after a truth is spoken aloud when no one dares to disturb the air it still lingers in. Marcus reached out, resting his hand lightly on the table near his mother's. He didn't grip it, didn't need to. The gesture was enough, an unspoken exchange between them that said everything words couldn't. Ethan shifted again, and for the first time since entering the courtroom, his eyes met Lillian's without flinching. He looked like a man who'd just been given a mirror and didn't quite recognize his own reflection. I was wrong," Ethan said, the admission rough, almost hesitant. Lillian gave him a single nod. "Then make it right," she replied simply. No lecture, no drawn-out scolding. Just a direction, a way forward if he was willing to take it. Marcus straightened, then his eyes sweeping briefly over the rest of the room. "We're done here," he said, his tone final. But there was no anger in it, only certainty. As he moved to guide his mother toward the exit, Harold's voice followed them. "Mrs. Moore," he called. She paused, glancing over her shoulder. "You've reminded all of us." Harold said that the law isn't just about statutes and codes. It's about the people it's meant to protect. Lillian offered the faintest of smiles, the kind that came from a place far deeper than simple satisfaction. And sometimes she replied, "It needs protecting too." With that, she stepped forward, her son matching her stride. The click of her heels echoed through the room, each step a quiet statement in itself. Behind them, Ethan remained by the door watching until they disappeared into the light spilling in from the hallway. His chest felt tight, but not from fear, more from the strange, humbling realization that the uniform on his back meant nothing without the respect to match it, and for the first time that day, he understood exactly what that meant. The heavy wooden door creaked open, and for the first time in what felt like hours, fresh air spilled into the station. Lillian stepped through, first Marcus, just behind her his arm, instinctively reaching for hers. She didn't resist. It wasn't about needing support, but about walking together, side by side. Outside, the midday sun was blinding at first, washing away the dim, tense air they'd left behind. It stretched their shadows long across the concrete, the shapes moving in perfect unison, like two halves of the same story. Marcus kept his voice low, though the street was quiet. "The world may not change overnight, Mom," he said, almost as if testing the thought aloud. Lillian's eyes stayed forward, the sun catching in them. "No," she said, her tone steady, measured, "but it changes every time someone chooses to do the right thing." Her words hung there for a moment, folding into the warm breeze. Marcus let them sink in. He'd seen his mother face plenty of storms before, but today had been different. Today she'd stood her ground not just for herself, but for something bigger, something that couldn't be put into a report or stamped with an official seal. Behind them, the station door hadn't yet closed. Through the narrowing gap, Harold stood in the doorway, hands in his pockets. His gaze followed them until they reached the edge of the steps. A smile tugged at his lips, not one of amusement, but of admiration, the kind you rarely see from a man who'd spent decades sifting truth from lies. "That's one hell of a woman," he murmured under his breath, though no one was close enough to hear. The door eased shut with a deep, echoing thud. And just like that, the noise of the world crept back in the faint hum of traffic, the rustle of leaves, the distant chatter of a city that had no idea what had just taken place inside. Marcus and Lillian started down the sidewalk, their pace unhurried. People passed by, unaware that the quiet pair had just left a room where lines had been drawn, truths laid bare, and pride humbled. The air felt different out here, cleaner somehow, as if the sun itself was intent on burning away whatever lingered behind those walls. Marcus glanced sideways at his mother. You know, he said some people would have lost their temper in there, would have made a scene. Lillian gave the smallest shrug. Anger might win the moment, she replied, but it rarely wins the day. They reached the end of the block where the light turned green and stepped off the curb together. Her heels clicked steadily against the pavement, each sound firm and certain, as though marking the rhythm of something larger than the two of them. From a bench across the street, an elderly man looked up from his newspaper and watched them pass. He didn't know. Their names, didn't know the weight of the moment, but there was something in their stride, something in the way the younger man matched the older woman's pace that made him pause and watch until they disappeared from view. Back at the station, Harold finally turned away from the door. The image of them walking into the light stayed in his mind, the way certain moments do when you know you've just witnessed something you'll carry for years. Inside, the silence they left behind wasn't the same as before. It wasn't tense, it was thoughtful, a little uncomfortable, as though the room itself knew it had been changed by what had happened. And outside, beneath the bright stretch of afternoon sky, Lillian and Marcus kept walking. Their shadows led the way, long and certain, carrying forward a truth that didn't need repeating. The world may not change overnight, but in that moment, in that small corner of the city, it had shifted just enough. Stories like this remind us that courage isn't always loud and justice doesn't always come in a flash. It's built choice by choice, moment by moment. If this story moved you, please take a second to hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Mr. Mac Stories for more powerful, thought-provoking tales. Your support means more than you know. It's what keeps our team inspired to keep creating stories that matter. Remember, here at Mr. Mac Stories, we believe in one thing: every voice matters, every story counts.